Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here, and I would like to say a special thank you to Professor Bei Wang, who has invited me, generously invited me over. I will speak in English because my Chinese is no good. But if I speak too quickly or you want to ask a question, please feel free to stop me and ask. We'll also have time for questions at the end. I want to talk to you about something fairly basic, about what we mean by language. I don't know what you think language is. Usually we assume we know what language is. We use language all the time. So I want to suggest that there are different ways to understand language, and that I want to emphasize two very different questions we can ask. And when we try to answer those questions, we arrive at very different ideas of what language is. So language, it seems, is not just one thing. The first way to ask, well, what is language, is to ask about communication. I don't think anyone's very surprised. We ask, how do we pass messages from me to you? So I have a secret thought, then I move my mouth, and then you suddenly know what I was thinking about. Or I have a secret thought, and I write a message, and I pass it to you, and you read it. And now suddenly you know what I was thinking about. It's quite magic. This is the way we usually, I think about language. And when we teach about language, we often speak of something called the speech chain, where inside my head is a secret idea, and then it gets turned into movements, which turn into vibration, which go into the ear, which someone else's brain understands. I don't know anything about insides of heads. I'm only talking about what we can see here. And speech is just one way that we can do this magic. Another way is through reading and writing, obviously. And when we say we study language, one kind of thing one might say is, oh, that's nice. Which language? And then the answer might be, I study English, or I study Chinese, or there's a language called Irish, or Yoruba, or French. You know these names of languages. And these might be the thing that you mean when we say language. Nobody's in the least bit surprised yet, okay? And when we do this as linguists, what we are studying is a system which is built up from some basic units which contrast with each other. So in linguistics, we speak of the domain of phonology, in which we have phonemes. The usual way to think about something called a language, like Chinese, is to think of a system in which sounds contrast with each other in the domain of phonology. Words contrast with each other in the lexicon or the dictionary. Sentences contrast with each other because of the way that the words are organized or sequenced. And meanings contrast with each other in another symbolic domain called semantics. Each time we're talking about systematic contrasts.
Yeah.
So I assume most people are very familiar with this picture. In phonology, you can see here the International Phonetic Alphabet, which tries to capture these contrasts in all languages. In syntax, we might have this kind of structure. And this is the usual way that language is discussed in the discipline of linguistics. In the 20th century, there's two halves to the study of language. In the first half, we have what's known as structural linguistics, and the person usually associated with this is Ferdinand de Saussure. And he distinguished between what he called langue and parole. Langue is the system. It's an abstract system. It's systematic in that it made up of these contrasts in different domains, and it's context-free, so that we can speak of a word without having to know who said it, when they said it, why they said it, where they said it. Parole is the much more messy business of tongues, contexts. It's concrete, it's vocal, it's the words that are spoken by people in particular contexts. This approach was very, very influential in the sciences, in the social sciences too, in anthropology, in a variety of disciplines. It gave rise to the notion of structuralism, which is the idea that you can study these kinds of systems in many domains, and that they are very important for understanding the human social world. The second half of the 20th century saw a different approach to language, and I've indicated Noam Chomsky there as the obvious founder of generative linguistics, but there were many similarities to structural linguistics. So he distinguished between competence and performance. Competence is abstract, it's mastery of a system, and your competence in a language does not tie you to a particular context. Your competence in a language is your ability to maintain and exploit these contrasts, but it does not care about where you speak, when you speak, why you speak, or whether you speak or write. Performance is much messier. This is the business of actual sentences, uttered, spoken, or written, usually spoken though, and is bound to context. So performance is this messy business that doesn't look systematic at all. And where structural linguistics gave rise to structuralism, which was a huge scientific development, generative linguistics was very important in what became the computational theory of mind, which is still extremely influential. And I want to tell you that they missed language. The 20th century of linguistics in the 20th century, by separating langue from parole and competence from performance, ignored almost everything that we need to know if we want to understand language. The sense of language that is discussed here is important, but it can only be developed by ignoring the context in which language occurs, the purposes for which language is used, and it is not the only way to ask this question about what is language. So I want to suggest to you that there is a second question that we are interested in, which gives us a very, very different idea of what language is. And this question is, what happened to our species? Something very strange happened to one kind of ape within the last 5 million years, 5 or 6 million years. Not a lot of time for biological evolution. Not much change happened in our bodies. We lost a lot of hair. The eyeball became white, which is important. The brains are essentially the same. Our forebrain is a bit bigger, but we have basically the same bodies as any other ape. So genetics is probably not going to help here. So when we ask this question, we need to be aware of our history as a species. Now, evidence for language use is hard to find. The oldest evidence is about 50,000 years old, and it is always indirect, because words leave no traces, and writing is fairly recent. So the kind of evidence we use to suggest, these look like people who use language, come from things like musical instruments. This is a bone flute. Command of fire, people's use of fire, people's use of their bodies to develop symbolic expressions, to paint, put their hands on things and leave an imprint, or draw pictures in caves. And the evidence for rituals, that is, the kind of coming together that we know lies at the heart of human society. Do you need to pause here for a second?
那个就先这样吧，等我们讲完了再弄吧。我给你拿个盆儿先接。因为有个盆儿，但是因为录像会录进去，所以我就还是不要用盆，就这样就可以了。So I don't want to put the basin here because I think it will be in the video.
It's fine. It's fine. Put the basin there.
Okay.
That means we can carry on with the talk.
Okay, all right.
It's a nice basin. Okay. Now, I'd like you to look at the blue line here. That line, let's suppose that line is 5,000 years, because that's the oldest form of writing. Writing has evolved at least 3 times independently, once in China, once in Mesopotamia, once in Central America, maybe separately in Egypt, we're not sure. But the oldest of these, the Mesopotamian system, is about 5,000 years old, and it didn't arrive with newspapers and emojis. The first writing was marks used to indicate how much of something was in a container, and then who owned it. And gradually it developed and became a means by which what we think of as texts could be expressed. And it took a long time before there was many people who could read or write, and an enormous amount of time before literacy was something that was common in humanity. Most people, at most time in our history, have not been able to read or write. And it was with the printing press, which is 500 years ago, that texts became so distributed that lots of people could read or write. So literacy is only this old, whereas writing is this old. Now I put in emojis here, because emojis are important in this story, but they're very recent. Emojis are about 5 years old. Right? And they're changing writing systems because writing systems have always changed. Writing has always changed, and emojis will be important someday. But here's the point. If you want to understand what writing is, you would not start with emojis. That's not where you would begin your study, right? That would miss a lot. So that's the timeline we just looked at, 5,000 years. Here's the timeline of our species. Our anatomically modern species is much older. It's about 1 million years old. But any evidence for language is about 50,000 years old. So this black line could be much longer. Here's writing. Look how small it is. And here's widespread literacy. It's about as small as the emojis. So if you want to understand what language is, it doesn't make much sense to start by asking questions that only make sense to people who are literate, who can read and write. No more than it would make sense to understand writing by starting with emojis. And that's what linguistics has done. When we speak of something called English or Chinese, these can only exist in a literate society where there's standardization, where we can define curriculums, we can say something is or is not a sentence of the language. If we go back 30,000 years, there's no borders between languages, there's no standardization. People just are really messy, they use their voices. And it's always the voice. The idea that language can be studied indifferently, whether it's spoken or written, is a very strange idea. Because for almost all this history, it was always the voice. People were always face to face. They always had their bodies involved. So structural linguistics and generative linguistics can answer a lot of questions. They can answer questions about something called English and Chinese, but they cannot answer the question about what happened to our species. And I think we are very interested in this question. This business of passing messages from mind to mind makes communication look like this. Solipsism is the idea that you have a private mind hidden from everyone else. That's kind of weird. Communication looks like this. When people are face to face, they are not separate from each other. They are coordinated with each other. They are present with their whole bodies. They are involved. This is what communication looks like. So we need another word. And I'm going to suggest that if we want to use the word language for something like Chinese and English, That's fine. Maybe we should use the word languaging for what these people are doing. A verb. Languaging. Try it out. I didn't like it when I first thought of this, but I realize now we need a verb. And that means using the voice and the eyes and the hands and the whole body in coordinating our activity to create a shared world. Because this is what language did for our species. It changed us from very local beings to a species who can share a world. Maybe that work is still ongoing. But I think if we want to understand what happened to our species, we may need to consider many kinds of activity. There's no guarantee that this will pick out a system of the kind identified by Saussure or Chomsky. And we need to look beyond what we always think of as language, which is conversation. I want to suggest to you there's a lot more that we need to look at. I want to show you some languaging by these two little gentlemen who do not have any lexis, any syntax, any semantics, but they can language like hell. I think we should take these little gentlemen very seriously indeed. Structural linguistics has nothing to say about what they're doing. Generative linguistics has nothing to say about what they're doing. But if we want to understand what languaging is and what happened to our species, we should be very, very interested in what they are doing. They are doing something very, very important. We had great fun with this yesterday in Bay's lab. And we're going to maybe work on developing this as an experimental method. Get people to language like this. So, all that was just to introduce my favorite topic, which is a form of languaging which is not covered by generative linguistics and not covered by structural linguistics. It's very familiar to all of you. And the weird thing is, I had to invent a name for it. Because nobody thought that it was important to point out that sometimes people say the same thing at the same time. If you've studied any generative linguistics, you know that at the heart of that is the emphasis on creativity. It's always new. The sentences have never been said before. What about those times where the sentences have been said before, or there's not even sentences? I define joint speech as the act of uttering the same words at the same time by multiple people. That's not complicated. It's very, very simple. I say utter because I want to, one thing we'll find is that there's no real difference now between speaking and singing. So I want to include one term that could include both. Where do people do this strange behavior? Well, they do it when they pray. They do it in the temples and churches all over the world. In every society, they do it in rituals. And they do it in courtrooms. And they do it in protest marches. Well, that's interesting. Protest and prayer. They're sort of strange siblings, aren't they? And they do it when they're watching football matches. They do it when they want to express their identity as supporters of a football club. They do it, in other words, in interesting places. And I want to suggest that whenever people speak the same words at the same time, there's something interesting going on that we need to understand. So we tried very hard to translate joint speech into Chinese, and the best way to show this is using joint speech. 3, 2, 1.
和声活动.
Thank you very much. My Chinese is not up to it. So it's an activity. I want to emphasize that it's an activity of speaking collectively. So these domains are not accidental. The simple definition draws us to aspects of our life that as social scientists you must surely be interested in. I'll add one more. So ritual and prayer, protest, sports, and early education. This is where we forge the identities we will carry later in life, where we become members of a community. These are all very, very interesting occasions. Now, this is such a simple definition, and it's so familiar, we don't have to do experiments to say a lot about it. Here's some interesting things that we can find, and it doesn't matter whether we're talking about prayer or protest or primary school or football. And that's interesting. First thing, speakers and listeners are not separate. Now, language. We always thought language was something in which I speak, you listen. Now you speak, I listen, right? Boing, 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 like a game of ping pong. Here, speakers and listeners are not separate, and everybody knows the words, so there's no creativity. In fact, the words are sometimes carefully preserved over hundreds of years. And repetition. The same thing is said again and again and again and again and again and again and again. Why? That's true in the football terraces, and it's true in the church, and it's true in the protest march, and it's true in the primary school. And there are many other occasions, but these are the main domains. It's because this is a performance. This is something that must be done. Not something that you're finished with when it's done once, but something that is done, has to be done again and again. And we'll see there's no way anymore to sustain a distinction between speech and between language and music, or between speech and song. We'll look at that in a minute, because joint speech is both at the same time. We'll see that there's structures, like you get syntax in written language, there are structures to joint speech. There's call and response, where one person says the complicated bits, and everyone gets to join in through joint speech by saying, well, if we're in church, maybe, amen. If we're at a protest rally, maybe, right on. Yeah. If we're watching a performance, everyone goes, hey. Everyone gets to join in, and this allows very complex messages to be spoken collectively, or to be joined in collectively. So this is something I call generalized assent. It means we have a way of joining in together. And the important thing that shines through all these domains is that in each case people are, I'm going to use these words, enacting an identity. Now, identity is complex. I do not mean a label that you carry from birth to death. I mean, when I say enactment, I mean something that you bring into being by doing. So when we cheer along, we are Beijing supporters. We support Beijing. Come on, Beijing. We are Beijing supporters. We are enacting, bringing into being our identity as Beijing supporters. And then we leave the football match, and now we go to the church, and we all stand up and we say, we believe in one God, Father Almighty. Now we are enacting our identity as churchgoers. And I don't care if anyone goes to church or doesn't go to church, we all take part in something like this. So speakers and listeners are no longer separate, so all this stuff is no use to us. Language 1, the first thing we asked about, is we can learn nothing here. I said maybe very few of you or nobody goes to church, but you all take part in rituals whether you know it or not. I want to show you a ritual with, as usual, a text that's composed elsewhere, where you're expected to know the words, and you all actually know this ritual. This is from my lab. Birthday to you, happy birthday dear
so to me. Happy birthday to you.
Hey! Have you all met Happy Birthday? It's a ritual. You're required to join in. You may even find yourself joining in for people you don't know because of the obligation to join in. It's a way to celebrate the identity of an individual, in this case Tony Shimero, my good friend. I'd like to introduce you to all these people because they're all lovely individuals, and this is how we celebrate an individuality. So rituals are hidden in our daily life. Repetition. This is true of, I'm going to show you examples here from prayer and protest. This is from the streets of Cairo during the Arab Spring. And over and over and over. Ashab Yurid Isqat an-Nizam means the people demand the fall of the regime. This was the call that led to so much disaster in the Arab Spring in 2011. But we find this in all protest movements. That particular rhythm originally comes from a protest movement in Chile in the 1970s, where it was the people united will never be defeated. El pueblo unido jamás será vencida. So these are preserved. They move around. And we find the same thing. This is Beijing, Hare Krishna. That's a Hindu ritual. I'm not suggesting you all take part in it, but some people do. There's so many traditions in which we repeat things over and over. Here this is called kirtan, and that's a mantra. The Hare Krishna mantra is repeated thousands of times, sometimes by one person in a day. I said it's a performance. When you become a new citizen of a country, you are required to stand up and to swear an oath. I don't know how to become a citizen of China. I've never tried. If you become a citizen of Ireland or of the United States or of Germany or of France, you have to swear an oath like this, and this sounds like this.
I hereby declare on oath.
I hereby declare on oath.
Now, that's not musical at all there, right? And this is spoken only once. That's quite exceptional. But it's very important that the words be said, and that they be said in public. And after that you are changed into a citizen. Those of you who may have met the work of John Austin, this is a speech act, a performative, which changes the person. You're a different person on the other side of this. But here's another performance. Parents love to see their children recite poems. This kind of joint speaking has a name. It's called choral speaking, and it's very popular in Asia, and it's very popular in Ireland, where I come from too, and probably in many other places. It's also a performance, a less serious performance, but it shows that this is usually a performance. Now I want to show you just some examples of call and response. Here's an example from a refugee camp in Haiti. Can I point out that you don't have to speak Haitian Creole to understand what's going on here? So this business of privileged languages, Chinese, English, French, is not so relevant here. Often in joint speech we find people don't even understand the words they're speaking. This is the role of Latin in the religious services of the East, of the Coptic in religious services in Egypt, of Ge'ez in Ethiopia. This is quite common. Here's this is also from China.
rejoice in the power of his glorious and holy and life-giving and divine mysteries. And with the living sign of the cross of our Lord, may you be sealed and guarded from all harm, hidden or open, now and always and forever and ever. Amen. Amen.
All the participants have to do is say Amen, but they get to take part in this very complicated, carefully preserved structure. Musicality. The only one we saw so far that was not musical was the swearing of an oath, and it's only done once. Once you start to repeat things, it becomes, well, musical. The word music is now, I've made the word language complicated. I'm now going to make the word music complicated. I want to ask you, is happy birthday music? Do you go home and put on a CD of your favorite renditions of Happy Birthday? I don't think so. And nobody listens to this as music, but... Those are fans of Manchester City United, Manchester City Football Club, and this is a chant they do. It's obviously kind of musical, but not music you would put on a CD, music you do. Much more beautiful, I think you'll agree. This is, the English word chant is nicely ambiguous because it applies to what protesters do, what the football players do, and what these monks do. The word chant, in other words, does not distinguish between the musical domain and the speech or language domain. This is also joint speech. And chant traditions have some very distinguished characteristics, so very few instruments. Everyone sings the same melody at the same time. There's no meter, so it's the speech-like rhythms that actually dictate how long the units are. I could go on. See if you identify this. I'll stop him there. That's a propaganda video from the Islamic State. You probably didn't expect that. They are very fundamentalist, these Wahhabi Islamists, and they dislike music. So they say. They break up instruments and forbid the playing of music, but all their propaganda has this unison chant with it. And they then also go on to do a swearing of allegiance just like those people in the ceremony. So they use joint speech just like everybody else, and they use something, well, we can clearly, there's no agreement here about what music is anymore, because they forbid music and yet they do this. Right? So repetition leads to rhythm, and then you get the gestures. Sometimes just this, sometimes this. Intonation turns into melody. And so we lose all difference between speech and song. So if language can be rethought of as languaging, maybe we need to rethink music as musicking. Or rather, to recognize that languaging and musicking overlap so substantially, there's probably no reason to keep them apart. We can see things that clearly make it, that emphasize the blurring of the division. Here, for example, we use a drum to keep time when rowing. Is that music? Is that language? It's coordination. I'm going to suggest that all these are coordination. And what languaging is a means of working together to create a shared world. Slaves, chain gangs, prisoners who are forced to work often compose songs to make the work bearable, to work together. You don't have to be in a condition of slavery for this, but working songs are very, very common. And especially when the work is repetitive, like a blacksmith, or if you're digging, then we find this wonderful use of music to coordinate. So I want to suggest that languaging includes all this. It includes you thinking to yourself in language. It includes me talking to you in a monologue. It includes us talking like dyads, which is where almost all of the linguistics work has been. It includes us speaking together as one. non-creatively but performatively. And it includes various kinds of chant which introduce musical elements, which get stronger, and now we find ourselves in music. We never left languaging. So, I'm going to just sum up a little bit. I could talk for all day about joint speech. It's so rich. But I want to suggest that joint speech, or 3, 2, 1. Again. Provides us with an unexplored way to understand languaging and the role of such activity in bringing about the human world. This was one of the questions that we wanted to answer when we approached the topic of language in the first place. What happens to our species? When we look at it in this way, we might better understand how different kinds of social identity, social order, and social relations arise. Obviously, joint speech is not done by one person, it's done collectively. This is not about the individual. Even singing happy birthday, it's a collective celebration of the individual. And it encourages us to pay attention to certain activities. We have now a good, strongly motivated, scientific reason to consider practices of prayer, protest, sports for chanting, and primary education together. That's interesting from an anthropological point of view, from a social science point of view. Because wherever joint speech is used, something interesting and important is going on that founds human societies. And these activities have been important in establishing all human societies at all times. I want to the little evidence we have, I'm not going to talk much about it, but we have some evidence that joint speech is as old as humanity, is much older than writing. The very, very first piece of literature we find clearly includes joint speech. It's a liturgical text from Iraq from 2,600 years before the Common Era. It's called the Kesh Temple Hymn, and it clearly includes verse chorus where everyone joins in. Now, how do we deal with this novel perspective scientifically? There are some problems. I tried to stay with simple definitions, but I can't hide the fact that the scientific language we have is not very good for talking about this. And there's, why did I have to invent a term for this? Why has this not been studied for hundreds of years? And I suspect it's because we think about these individual human minds a bit too much. Right? Scientific psychology comes in many flavors, but this computational theory of mind, or cognitive psychology that's currently very popular, always talks about an individual, and it has very deep philosophical problems, and it's just no good for talking about joint speech, because this is something that happens between people collectively. We need a different language, there you go, so a different vocabulary to study this. And I want to suggest we're developing one. One of the most interesting and exciting developments in cognitive science over the last 30 years is coming together of various strands which today are often referred to as 4E cognition. These 4 E's stand for the words extended, embodied, embedded, and enacted, and I'm going to say just a little bit about each. I don't have time to give a full introduction to 4E cognition, but I want to suggest that we do have a scientific language which is currently being developed that will be useful for addressing this. So if you've never met this, 4E cognition is just a useful term to group together some quite different concerns. Extended, let's start with that one. That is drawn from a 1998 paper by the philosophers Andy Clark and Dave Chalmers called The Extended Mind. And in this paper, they made a very clear argument that we probably should not think of cognition, whatever that is, as being in the head. It's something that necessarily involves the world too. Now, when I teach this to students who are trained in scientific psychology, they go, oh, the mind is leaking out of the head. That's not the point. The point here is it was never in there in the first place, but it was always your relation to the world. So this doesn't, this suggests, let's not talk about brains, let's not talk about heads. Let's talk about the world and our being in the world, the way in which we exist in the world. So that's a useful starting point, and this has given rise to many, many, many books, conferences, papers. Extended mind is a useful idea to help us to change some discussions. Embodiment is the big, big theme in cognitive science at the moment. Again, having focused forever and ever on brains, we've had the various ideas. Behaviorism just looked at input-output relations and gave up trying to understand what was inside. Identity theory suggests that your mind and brain are the same thing. The most common approach in scientific psychology is called functionalism, which says that the things we want to talk about, like language, somehow come from the brain. Embodied cognition really says, stop with the brain. The brains, kidneys, livers, they're all very interesting. They're all parts of the body. And the body is in the world. And cognition is a relation between an embodied subject and the surroundings. So here you can see this loop here suggests when we take the body very seriously, we have to consider many things that we discuss, aspects of mind, as being relational, as lying between people and their worlds. It's a radical idea. Embedded, that's the third E. This one is talked about less, but it's maybe the most important. I've mentioned several times that language 1, language studied by linguistics, ignores context. Languaging screams context. Look at the context, look at where it's happening, who's doing it, why are they doing it, where are they doing it, what time of day is it, what clothes are they wearing, what's the temperature in the room, how are they moving their bodies. These are all important questions. The meaning of languaging is not hidden in the words, it's right there in the context. So when we use this small definition of joint speech, we're drawn to these contexts: ritual, protest, education, sports. These contexts that ground human societies. No human behavior, I would suggest, can be understood absent the context, without taking the context into consideration. And no utterance, no words spoken by someone are meaningful if you take them out of the context. And yet, linguistics has studied things like, John gave the ball to Mary. Who's John? Why did he give her the ball? Where's Mary? Did he pay for it? What did she think of that? What's going on? So, clearly, if we study languaging, they're the questions we're interested in, and not phrase structure. The fourth E opens up an entire new world. This is only in its infancy, and I can say even less about this, but I can just give you a little pointer. Enaction is for me a useful word because it means bringing into being by doing. Suppose we want to have a parade. Now we can sit around and we can draw pictures of a parade. We can tell each other stories about a parade. We can tell all our friends that we're going to have a parade. But the only way to have a parade is to get out and march. Right? That's the only way to have a parade. So a parade is enacted. Languaging speaks of bringing into being by doing. Enaction, then, is a fundamentally new approach to studying minds and bodies, all these problems, and it's rooted in biology and not in psychology. And its intellectual roots are Buddhist and not Christian. This is important. Scientific approaches developed in Europe have a strong Christian influence, which speaks of the perennial Christian concerns of free will and independence. These are what I would think of as Protestant concerns, and they're hidden in the science. Buddhism emphasizes relations rather than essences. And when we look at joint speech, we are interested in relations. So it's no accident that this is some of the background to the development of enaction. So generally we're going to be more concerned with relations between people, coordination, what comes into being as we work together, rather than control. I'm just going to give you a flavor of this. How do you use this vocabulary? So we might take a system to be a cell. We might take a system to be a body. We might take a system to be a crowd of people. A system comes into being, or is enacted, through self-production and self-distinction. And this happens through the activity of the system. This little drawing illustrates this, that the circle indicates the system, which through its activity distinguishes itself from the environment. That works in the philosophy of biology, to distinguish what a cell is, to identify what life itself is. And very often the term used here is mind and life. So mind as a property of life, not as a property of brains. We often use the term sense-making as a general term for this kind of activity. So the sense-making of a cell is different from the sense-making of me here right now, and that's different from the sense-making of a crowd of football supporters. But in each case, this term is useful for describing how an identity, how a systemic identity is brought into being. And here's the kicker. With this language, we can move between consideration of a single cell and its sense-making to multiple systems and their joint sense-making, because if my sense-making involves my interaction with the world, and your sense-making involves interaction with the world, and we're sense-making together by chanting, for example, then we are enacting a common world. That is way too philosophical, and I'm sorry, I can only give you a sense of how exciting it is that there are new terms that are available to us to move beyond the psychology and linguistics of the 20th century. This is under development. This is, of course, contested. There are many different ways in which these core concepts are understood, but I've shown you my favorite domain of joint speech. And I can only tell you I find these words to be useful in a way that the terms I learned when I trained in psychology and linguistics are not useful. So maybe we need different vocabularies for different things. That's not so surprising, right? If we're studying geology, we use specialized vocabulary for studying geology. If we're studying economics, we use specialized vocabulary for studying economics. If we're studying, now here we come, we don't have an agreed suite of terms for social science. Social science is not in the Academy of Science. They make a special academy for it. There's no need for that. Right? We can all belong together because we're all sense-making together. I'm going to stop. Joint speech has a home. There's a website, jointspeech.ucd, that's my university.ie. I wrote a book on the topic, and if you email me, there's my email, I will happily send you a PDF. Bay here is the only one who's read it in the entire world. She said it doesn't hurt too much. Email me, there's lots of examples there. There's lots of talks. This talk will one day be there. I let it out the leak. Because it's a delight to be able to introduce you to my topic, which is not widely known, but I think is very familiar to everybody. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity.